Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Talking to Our Time Artist Talk. I'm Melissa Chu, and I'm director of the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C. It's our great pleasure this afternoon to be with Paul Farber and Ken Lum, otherwise known as the Monument Lab. We're here to hear about their important work, which will be moderated by our curator, our Hirshhorn curator, Anne Reeve. Before I turn it over to Anne to moderate the conversation, I'd just like to invite you to check out our website, because every Wednesday, beginning on the 17th with Christoph Wodiczko in the fall, we have a series of artist talk programs. We also have on September 17th our virtual Futurist Ball, where we're going to be hosted by Machine Dazzle for all sorts of art and fashion programs. But more than anything else, please do stay in touch with us via our social channels and our website. We're excited to connect with you. Without further ado, I'd love to hand over to Anne Reeve, who will be really moderating this conversation today, all about the importance of recognizing where we are in this moment and the idea of monuments and how all of the questions around those. So thank you so much. Over to Anne.
Thank you so much, Melissa. It's a pleasure to bring us all here together today with Ken Lum and Paul Farber of Monument Lab. Ken and Paul, and forgive me as I'm gonna read from this so I don't miss anything, are both based in Philadelphia and both teach at the University of Pennsylvania. Ken as the Chair of Fine Arts at the Stuart Weitzman School of Design, and Paul as Senior Research Scholar at the Center for Art and Public Space, which I believe is also part of the School of Design. They both have dynamic and extremely accomplished individual practices. Ken as an internationally renowned artist who works in a range of media, including painting, sculpture, and photography, and he often engages with public art and spatial politics. Paul Farber is a curator, historian, and educator whose work explores urban histories, cultural memory, and creative approaches to civic engagement. Paul is also a writer. He has published notably and often, but I will call attention to his latest book. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of that here, which is A Wall of Our Own, An American History of the Berlin Wall, which was published earlier this year by University of North Carolina Press. What I do have a copy of here is Ken Lum's recent book, also published this year in 2020. I can and will highly recommend this. It came out with Concordia University Press and is titled Everything is Relevant, Writings on Art and Life. Together, Ken and Paul founded Monument Lab in 2012, which they define as an independent public art and history studio that cultivates and facilitates critical conversations around the past, the present, and the future of monuments. Monument Lab operates in a variety of modes. It seems like the list is growing every year. They organize exhibitions and conferences. They have recently launched a fellowship program. They have a podcast, and together they recently published this book, also earlier this year, Monument Lab, Creative Speculations for Philadelphia, came out with Temple University Press. This book is a compendium of the major exhibition Monument Lab organized in 2017 in Philadelphia. They also refer to it as a living handbook for those in other communities who may wish to critically engage monuments within their own civic and public spaces. Hyperallergic, in their recent review of the book, wrote that in 2020, Monument Lab Creative Speculations is not merely a living handbook, but also an uncanny prophecy. So I joined the Hirshhorn staff in 2018 and have found myself thinking a great deal about monuments ever since, both as someone whose job calls me to think about art in public space, but also in relation to the Hirshhorn's location on the National Mall. The mall, of course, being a field of monuments and memorials, and feels something like a stage, which has the ability to sort of grab everything in its path and implicate it into a larger conversation about power. And I think in 2020, we are certainly watching those conversations about power and monuments play out in real time. In some ways, it feels like our national conversation is just now catching up to the work that Ken and Paul have been doing for quite a while already. And as such, it feels like a very auspicious moment to bring us all together and hear from them about Monument Lab's evolution, the nature of this work, both past and present, and also what this work brings to their understanding of our current moment and their understanding of the future of monuments in America. So Ken and Paul, I will invite you to turn on your cameras and join us. It's wonderful to have you today. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Great to see you. Great to see you both. So I wanted to start, for better or worse, with Instagram, because in addition to all of your varied activities, Ken, you have a really great Instagram account, which I would encourage everyone to check out. And you posted last week very thoughtfully, it was sort of a retrospective post, looking back on Monument Lab's evolution and hypothesizing as to why it seems to have struck a chord. And you attributed some of its successes in part to the fact that though not everyone who works with Monument Lab is an artist, that everyone, quotes, thinks like an artist. And I was hoping to hear more about that, about how you and Paul structure your understanding of and ethos for Monument Lab, and then we can see how that starts to play out through some of those early projects in Philadelphia.
Sure, since I wrote that, I'll start.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the great things of about art is it's naturally interdisciplinary. It doesn't contest or testing limits of definition, and including limits of and transgressing limits imposed in terms of speech, in terms of what we can say, what we can't say, what we can address, what we cannot address, what we can acknowledge, what we are not supposed to acknowledge, and what voices we are supposed to give greater attention to and lesser attention to, right? All those are rules, unspoken rules, unwritten rules that are in society, which we normalize, and we start growing up, and they become part of the guidepost for how we're supposed to negotiate through society. And so, but the art was always this one category, I would say. Maybe there's others, but I know best art, which was premised on at least challenging or unsettling the stability of all those types of categories of comportment, of speech, of discourse, and so on. So that's what I mean by thinking like an artist, thinking outside compartmentalization, thinking outside categories.
Yeah, you know, I think about the way that we've come into an understanding over time of our work, which is that Monument Labs is a socially engaged art project that takes the form of a civic agency. And in part, that comes, of course, out of deep considerations that we thought of from the beginning to bring to bear prototyping monuments, the collection of data about monuments, but also that bringing forward into public spaces different forms of question asking that weren't looking for one winner, but instead a kind of multitude of responses to change a conversation around monuments, around what we've inherited and what's possible. But in the kind of development of Monument Lab, while we've seen ourselves, especially in the beginning, as kind of operating with 1 foot in a classroom, 1 foot in an archive, 1 foot in the museum or gallery space, and 1 foot outside, there would be these moments where we'd be brought into a meeting, say over a dozen municipal agencies with the city of Philadelphia at that time. We're around a table. You hear transportation, you hear health and human services, you hear, of course, the public art office, and we were invited, and we say Monument Lab is here. And no one's wincing, no one's kind of taken back. We're just expected to be there by virtue of having produced work in public space. And so we've followed that, and over the last few years, really thought about on one hand, you know, gathering together, both within our team and across our fellows program and all of our collaborators, people who are experts. They might be experts in part because of what they've read and what they've taught, but they're more so because of how they've lived, they've practiced. They're artists, they're activists, they're community organizers, and they have a specialized knowledge and expertise. And at the same time, we want to bring that to bear in spaces to not just have really interesting conversations or interesting outcomes, but to make sure that art is profoundly shaping process as well. You can have different outcomes that way. And that's kind of how some of how we've come to think about this.
Right. And it seems too like a big emphasis there is on making sure that the conversations that you're having don't remain sort of insular, that those edges fray, and that the voices you're bringing into those conversations are people who may not be familiar with or engage art much at all. And so they have this opportunity through Monument Lab to have kinds of conversations that they mightn't otherwise, but, you know, which directly impact the spaces in which they live and operate. So maybe we should take a look at the first slide, and you can talk us through this project, which I think dates from 2015, and we can start to see how all of this comes together in the work that you do.
Yeah, so this is an image of the first prototype monument that we worked on. And this was a vision by the late artist, Terry Adkins. And I'll say a few things and then pass it to Ken. When we started and Ken and I met, we were teaching classes at the University of Pennsylvania. Ken was new to Philadelphia, having arrived from Vancouver. I was coming home. I'm from Philadelphia, but I lived elsewhere for a few years and actually was just coming from DC, where I was writing my dissertation. And we wanted to take the conversations that we were having in our classrooms and push them outward and do an engaged art and research project outside. We had ideas of expanding it across the city and even to other places, but we said, let's focus on one place, and that was the courtyard of our city hall in Philadelphia. This was a city, of course, that was mapped before it was built. It was lived in for 10,000 plus years by the Lenni Lenape people before it was ever founded or inhabited by colonists. And that history kind of circulated in large part around the center of the city where City Hall was, because it's the high ground in the city. It was imagined from the colonial founding as a center place. And we said this would be the place to start for our work. Rather than coming up with a thesis where we know the answer of what's necessary for a city at that time undergoing a lot of growth, but profound challenges in public education, in the murder crisis, in terms of poverty and equity, we wanted to ask a question. And that question we borrowed from municipal art language. What is an appropriate monument for the current city of Philadelphia? That word appropriate is what was borrowed, because appropriate doesn't mean one thing. For some people, it's practical. For some people, it's moral or imperative. Others, it's pragmatic, possible. And we wanted to ask that to as many people as we could and have an artist project at the center to kind of spur and invite imagination, to remind people about the hand they have in shaping public space. Ken, do you want to elaborate on that with Terry specifically?
Terry's proposal was to deal with the crisis in public education. Not just public education, but the public sphere in general in the United States in an increasingly monetized, privatized society. And so the proposal was based on a drawing by the early Quaker English Joseph Lancaster from the late 18th century, early part of the 19th century. And he was a theorist of public education. And he made these lines in terms of these are where the pew-like seats should be, and here's where the blackboard should be. It was very, very simple and quite austere. And of course, Terry was playing on the idea that, 200 years earlier, and even more than 200 years earlier, there was actually a much more advanced notion and value placed on public education than there is present day. because the Philadelphia public school system is under incredible stress, financial shortcomings, and competition from private for-money schools and taking away funding towards public schools. And so we thought we couldn't think of a more amazing kind of contribution to this moment in 2015 than to talk about this shrinkage of the public sphere in society.
Yeah, and I would just say, you know, something that's bittersweet about this project. There have been a lot of different ways that artists and political figures and community members have commented on the crisis in Philadelphia, specifically in 2012, the closure of over 20 public schools in predominantly Black and Brown communities. And Terry came up with this project that he said he wanted a sculpture. It would be critical, but it would be inviting. It wouldn't be set off on a pedestal for just people to look at. It was meant to be filled. Terry handed in his proposal for this project on a Thursday and passed away on a Saturday. Mm-hmm. And, you know, we weren't sure what to do. It was such an, I remember receiving the proposal and thinking, we got to get to work. So we paused for a moment. We spent a lot of time in conversation with Terry's widow, Merrill, with students of his, including Wilmer Wilson and Charles Hall, and then worked with a circle of people who really were continually inspired by Terry, including Rare, a recycled artist in residence at Revolution Recovery, to create a sculpture in this space that was a crossing ground. And so I think just, you know, to think about this project really kicked off, and thanks to Terry's vision that lived beyond him, this idea that education is public as a moray, as a value, as a line item, and he wanted us and the greater public to think about that in that space. And in the background of this image, off to the right, you see the kind of makings of our first lab, a research pavilion, where we hired youth researchers, a social worker, and a public historian. And it was a different kind of classroom, where on one hand, you have a classroom that's empty, waiting to be filled. And that classroom is where we collected monument proposals. We asked people what they thought an appropriate monument would be. And this interplay between a prototype monument, it's not permanent, it's not universal, but no monument is permanent, no monument is universal. And matching that with a space for conversation, a space for data gathering, that really set off a vision for us that we've replicated in different forms in our work since.
It's also important to note that the courtyard of City Hall, despite its centrality in terms of the city, it's at the geographic center of the city, according to William Penn's plan. And so symbolically, it's you know, without doubt, the most important space and potentially the most important public space in the city of Philadelphia. And yet it was always locked up at around by 6 o'clock in the evening with chain link fence. And so we were in proposing this Terry Adkins work, we insisted that it needed to be open through the evening, or at least until it turned dark. And the City Hall actually pushed back on us, and the reason being that people might actually hang out there, right? Not that they would be implying that there is nothing but troublemakers. I remember one civic official says, "You don't know Philadelphians, you don't know them," and so on. So there was a very negative view of their own citizenry, right? And so we somehow persuaded enough people to say, give it a chance, and so someone, because we thought some of them were, you know, had long memories of Philadelphia, and maybe at one time it was just downtown was so depleted that they shut it down. But since the late part of the 1990s, Philadelphia has been on a upsurge in terms of renewal, and so that happened, and people would be, you know, picnicking there, and it became very popular. Ice cream vendors would take their spot there, and all kinds of activities would happen in the evening hours previously verboten to enter. And so one of the lessons we learned very early on in the exercise of Monument Lab is how space is produced and consumed. And that has become a kind of very salient consideration in any project we do.
And it seemed to manifest in the 2017 project. Maybe we can speak about a couple of the prototypes associated with that exhibition. But I believe, a very significant piece of that, and very intentional piece of the way that exhibition was structured, was that you worked within multiple sites all over the city of Philadelphia, that it was very important to you and quite significant that none of this be an isolated exercise. Maybe you could speak a little, help us understand that a little bit more.
Yeah, for us, and Ken is often saying this, and we echo it, that all public art is in conversation with all other forms of public art, architecture, and the residents of the city around it. That despite the kind of traditional notion that a monument is a site of spectacle, that it's above us, that it commands attention as a focal point, when you take a step back and you kind of look at the composition of the civic landscape, you realize these relationships of power and presence are really much more complex. And so it's important for us to think about Center City, think about the historic landscape and infrastructure of the city, but to ask questions of here and there, to ask questions of public space as we understand it by sight, but actually operate in a number of spaces that include federally run land by Independence Hall, privatized public space, municipal spaces, vacant lots, and museums, and thinking about public space in a different kind of way. And so we continue to work from our question, what is an appropriate monument for the current city? We partnered with Mural Arts Philadelphia, and then 10 other municipal agencies and countless other community organizations, arts organizations to do this citywide project. And it was in the fall of 2017, 20 artists from around the world and around the city participated. And we really wanted to see them respond to the question with a range of monumental structures. And that would include large sculpture, that would include kind of public environments for exchange, and then that would include the ephemeral, light, sound, and all together operating around this idea that we define monument as a statement of power and presence in public. And so alongside those prototype monuments would be labs staffed by youth research teams run by artist educators, where there's this interplay that there's a prototype monument, there's also a lab collecting. And we engaged 250,000 people in person and another close to 2 million online. And this image that we're looking at right now kind of epitomized our feeling, which was, we always want to invite people into a conversation, but we are ambivalent about monuments. Monuments hold sway, they instruct, they make lasting impressions, but they are not isolated. They're part of systems, those of belonging and those of injustice. So this project by the artist Tanya Bergera is an ambivalent monument. It's a monument that's very traditional in many ways. It's elevated, it's figural, with that figure looking off into the distance. But Tanya titled this The Monument to New Immigrants, and didn't want any identifiable race, ethnicity, gender, and wanted this to be made from unfired clay. So over time, it would fall apart slowly, and that there was another waiting in wet clay, wrapped, kept wet, so that when it would fall apart, another one would go out. And she wanted people to think about immigration in terms of the kinds of presence and absence, the way that immigration has shaped our country, but also the loss that is part of it. And this is a different kind of monument, but it was poetic, it was powerful. It was at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and we would get pictures from people who'd go by it every day and pay attention. And I think that's key for all the monuments that are in headlines today. There's another 100 that we walk by every day and ignore, despite the amount of power that it took to put it in, and that amount of resources and the kind of systems that they uphold. So the ability to pause and think about the process of how monuments are created, but also how they live in a city, it's an insight into how we can think about art, imagination, and justice together.
Yeah. I hope you didn't hear my daughter come in.
Zoom life.
I just wanted to also add, in response to your question, and that we didn't want we wanted to contest the privileging of the downtown. That the city, that the project was about all of Philadelphia, inclusive of as many Philadelphians as possible. And rather than just see it purely as, well, we'll just distribute work all over the city, which we did, we were more interested in interpolating the viewer, the possible spectator, to actually embody a kind of trajectory throughout the city. And so they take in the city, they discover the city anew. There, you know, in any city, there are people from that city, they may have even grown up there all their lives, and they would never have set foot in another neighborhood, right? For all kinds of reasons, right? Some good, some not so good reasons, and so on. So for this project, there was permission, you might say, for all Philadelphians, all visitors to visit all of Philadelphia in order to really do a deep dive in terms of the constitution of the city.
Right, and for visitors to offer their own contributions then in turn, right? Maybe we can take a look at the next slide and talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, you know, we were talking about presence and absence. And this work by the artist, Karen Olivier, I think epitomizes this, you know, and Karen is a brilliant artist, a kind person, generous spirit. She's was born in Trinidad, now lives in Philadelphia and is a professor at Temple's Tyler School of Art and Architecture. And Karen lives in the Germantown neighborhood, which, you know, dates back, of course, to getting its name from being a colonial home for German immigrants. Before that, and adjacent to where this project was, there's a Lenni Lenape walking trail that it comprises current-day Germantown Avenue. This is a colonial area. George Washington's summer home is just up the block. Notable sites related to the Underground Railroad are nearby here. But this neighborhood has pronounced different kinds of historical institutions. There's a cobblestone street of Germantown Avenue, and there's a lot of kind of public revelry around the colonial and revolutionary times. Even though today it's a predominantly African-American and working class neighborhood. And that's reflected also in institutions like the Black Writers Museum and the Aces Museum and Uncle Bobby's coffee shop. Karen, we asked her to do a project in this park, and she said, I want to work with as much that is here as possible. I can bring in something, but I have to work with what's here. And that's going to be my philosophy, because in turn, it's what's missing. And what's the kind of distance between what is here and what is not. And she noted that in this park, there's a statue to a historic figure, Daniel Pastorius, who was a German immigrant. He was one of the first people to sign on to a protest against slavery in the colony of Pennsylvania, a group of Quakers before the larger kind of Quaker faith and institutions took on the cause. He was one of those signers pushing against slavery. There's a statue that was dedicated to him in the early 20th century. But between World War I and World War II, because he was German, even from an earlier period, the city put a box over that monument, saying it was too Germanic, we were at war with the Germans. And, you know, because this project in 2017 was part of these tremors of the larger movement we're seeing now to reckon with monuments, especially those that are racist or honoring Confederate figures. Karen was really interested in how a monument stays hiding in plain sight and what happens in that moment. And so for her, she wanted to make literal this notion that monuments reflect us, but how? So she covered a Revolutionary War monument with mirrored acrylic to actually reflect everyone around. And there were, depending on the angle, you would see everything around you, the bus going up Germantown Avenue, the foliage above, and other times the monument would disappear. And for her, in addition to the kind of built power of this, it was the conversation. She spent a lot of time before this ever went out in circles of artists and neighbors. While it was being installed, she held court at this monument, and we had all kinds of discussions about what would happen if it was vandalized or if something changed over time. And she just said, let's trust, let's see. It was never vandalized. In fact, it was cleaned once a week by a self-appointed conservator in the neighborhood. Yeah, there were prayer circles, there were dances. There was, of course, selfies, but this was a site of pilgrimage. And as one resident told Karen, and she later testified in front of city council recently during a Philadelphia budget crisis, that a neighbor said that they felt like they weren't forgotten because this went in, not because it was permanent, but because of the presence of the art and the artist. And so this still, even in flyers for events about this park or even books about this park, this image stays, even though it was a temporary prototype project.
Right. So, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I just very quickly, I wanted to just emphasize how important that last point Paul made is. There's very deep-seated skepticism that we were kind of interlopers, right? We were part of the official cultural world, and we were coming in, and people, citizens of Germantown neighborhood would say, "Why do you come here? You've never come here before. You've never cared about us, and why should we entrust you to, come and then just leave?" And so on. So one of the things that we really worked hard at Monument Lab was to really create a sustainable dialogue with the various neighborhoods that we're involved in. And that's a lot of work, right? So that we wouldn't come in as just, we plop something down for the term of the exhibition and then we leave, right? So we had all kinds of social events. We had free food. We had all kinds of events that were family oriented. And we were there a lot of times. I mean, a lot of times, and we had all kinds of really amazing dialogue. Some of the dialogue was fraught and it was, we unfiltered even. And so that's the hard work that I think is necessary for democracy to really take place.
Right. And it seems in the way that people were demonstrating their connection to this and living with it, that communities started to feel their sense of ownership and connection to these sites that they maybe hadn't articulated in that way before. I wanted to go back to the word permanence or permanent/temporary, because that's come up a few times, and I think that's where we get into trouble with monuments often, right? This presumption of permanence. And your project very clearly calls these prototypes. The implication is that they are temporary, at least for this moment. I was wondering if you could speak about that tension and your thinking around that idea.
Ken, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, monuments are generally seen as consensual, unitary, and the consensus is wrapped around this narrative that the values are being presented are eternal, right? And not to be challenged precisely because of their presumed universality. But of course, we also know that universality was constructed. It had a tendency, and it's not something that's natural. It's something that we've been taught to accept without question, which makes it very different. And so, and so this is something Paul always brings up, and even the idea of its appearance looking permanent is a mirage, because in order to maintain the appearance of permanence, you have to go through a lot of energy expenditure and muscle to maintain it, right? You have to scrub it, you have to wax the bronze statue, you have to make sure those weep holes are still open at the end of the year. So even the appearance of permanence is a kind of construction of a budget and maintenance. And so that's what we were really trying to unveil, was this kind of myth of the permanence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it feels hard to let go of the idea of permanence, but let's just try it as a thought process. We're so dependent on categories of temporary and permanent, not just in public art, but in museum talk as well. The permanent loan, the temporary loan,
the permanent collection.
The permanent collection.
Exhibition. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, nothing's permanent. I think what we see in monuments is, and museums for that matter, is the aura of permanence, a promise or a hope for permanence. But actually what we're seeing is a longing and an exertion of power, the idea that we're trying to freeze time. The Smithsonian Magazine did a study several years ago about the $40 million that it took to upkeep variety of Confederate sites across the United States. And it ranged from the upkeep of statues to the kind of ongoing things that we might feel are so mundane, right? But it's hard to track this, but what if as a proposition, all of the money spent on upkeep of monuments to make them feel permanent and look permanent and be there forever was spent on new artwork or was spent on community partnerships or education? What happens if permanent is no longer in our usage and our vocabulary? Mm-hmm. I think the questions that we're interested in is, how do you make lasting imprints that speak across generations, but not rely on this idea of permanence? Because, thinking of climate change, thinking of other modes of fragility, nothing will be permanent. So how do we accustom ourselves to thinking about, we're shaping values and visions for future generations. We're leaving behind monuments or detritus, or maybe a little bit of both. Mm-hmm. We're seeing them as overlap. Permanence, sometimes the word progress puts that impetus on other people. It will happen on its own, passive construction. It's going to be passed off. And I think when it comes to institutions, when it comes to art, when it comes to our civic values, how do we grab hold more of some of the toughest questions, which is making lasting gestures, and also build in the power to layer, to shift, to evolve? It's, of course, signage is an option, but what if we're building into the very processes of upkeep, pivoting, evolution, layering? It's often told to us as an either or. You either keep all the monuments or you get rid of them. And there is such an area in between that is more appropriate to our time, which is struggling with how we move forward, what we've inherited from the past, and what we're planning to dismantle or build anew. And that's the framework we're thinking about.
Yeah, and permanence isn't simply something, a term that kind of issues out as a kind of condition of understanding a monument's behavior, so to speak, right? We're supposed to bestow this sense of permanence on the monument. But there's also an element of a desire on the part of a lot of viewers for permanence, right? Because permanence in the sense of it being a synonym for coherence in a society that's very fragmentary, very fraught, very disjunctural, and oftentimes very difficult for people to make sense of. And so there's this desire on the part of a lot of people, and I have that desire too, to have more coherence, to have something at least more stable, and so on. So I understand how it gets kind of confused in a way with the way we interact with monuments and the demands they make.
Yeah. Well, we're going to open it up in about 5 to 10 minutes for some questions. So I'd encourage anyone who has questions to write them into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. But in the meantime, I want to make sure that we can get through some of these next slides, and we can hear from you on these additional facets of Monument Lab's work.
Yeah. So the image here is
pavilions, right? Yeah.
Yeah, this is, the other part of the prototype monument. The flip side of it is lab spaces, where there's an investment in time, but also financial resources in conversations. And this is one that you see the Karen Olivier, the battle is joined in the background. We've done them out of shipping containers that are staffed by high school fellows, college students, artist educators, under the direction of shared research projects. There are cities that have one book festivals that everyone's meant to read a book, and you have events around that. We kind of do one question festivals where we want to ask a question with as many different responses as possible. And these are places that meet people where they are. We have done other variations on this with the Pulitzer Foundation in St. Louis, the Highline Network at various sites. And the idea is to think about inquiry and question asking and discovery as part of public space. And these are, as part of the exhibition, in addition to, eventually putting out the book that you mentioned, we did a 2018 report to the city, which was a reflection on these, what we learned in the process of talking about public space in public space.
And I think the next couple of slides show us what that report maybe looks like. Or this is the kind of data collection that you are doing with visitors, correct?
Yeah, and just to say briefly about this, our first idea was to build an app, and we pitched this to our research director, Lori Allen, and a team of youth advisors back in 2013, 2014. We said, we're gonna have an app, and it's gonna have this toolkit for how to build monuments, and it's gonna take 5 minutes. What do you think about that? And they said, first of all, no one has 5 minutes for you who you've never met. You'd be lucky to get one. And have you ever used an iPad outside? What if there's no charge? What if it's raining? Actually, instead of thinking of the data part of your project as the front end where you razzle dazzle, think about data as the confirmation that your ideas were counted. So make your interface the whole experience. People see something from 100 feet away. What brings them close? People walk by and they're busy. They have work. They have appointments. What would make them take information from you, like in a newspaper? Could they see big messages? And then if they come, how do you give them a form that has such a low threshold for entry? It won't break. The great thing about a paper form is if you disagree or want to add something extra, you just write outside of the margins and make the final part the data part, where someone can watch their idea being scanned, a pin in a map being dropped. Similar to the feeling that you have when you get an I voted sticker. Mm-hmm. It's a performative act, but it's one that makes you feel like this bigger civic process was brought down to a moment of exchange. And that's kind of always the energy we like to have, that people are generous with their time. They don't need to stop. Even if they wanted to, they can't always. So make it as easy as possible for people to contribute, including in written language or pictures, and utilize the size of a blank piece of paper and the backdrop of a clipboard as the way to comprise city data. That this data now lives in municipal repositories next to crime statistics and traffic statistics. Cultural memory is hard to gather in this way. So it can't just be neat. It actually has to leave the fingerprints, so to speak, of the people who contributed on it.
So maybe you can go on.
Sorry. This data gathering process was something which, when we were starting to think about the exhibition, we asked ourselves, how can we distinguish this exhibition from pretty well every other large-scale citywide exhibition, right? In the sense that we did not want it just, I put in quotation, to be an art exhibition, right? That lasts a few months and that was it. We really wanted it to be a research exercise, an exercise in heeding democratic voice, and in terms and data gathering by listening to various individuals from neighborhoods about their lived experience, about their relationship to the city, about their relationship to the monumental inventory of the city.
So quickly, talk us through the report, because I think that data you mentioned now is living alongside and as part of these municipal records, but it was not commissioned by the municipality, correct?
That's right. No one asked for a report to the city
right.
from us. So, yeah. But I would say once we said we would commit to it,
yeah.
there was, oh, we're in the mayor's office. We'd like to see that report. How will it go about? And I think, think about a quote, and I'm paraphrasing here, from Black lesbian feminist poet Audre Lorde, who said, the rumor that you can't take on City Hall is spread by City Hall. And so we kept showing up, and we did the work, and we gathered together these findings, and we presented it to the mayor's office, to all of the municipal offices, police department, fire department, the airport, but wanted to kind of value what participants said. It's not in a sense that this project started this conversation. When we began our research, we felt like we were late. We felt like these conversations were already happening in communities. And I think that's a big premise behind this newspaper, which you can download for free online. There are print copies that were put in public libraries and elected officials' offices. But it was the idea that if you want to understand the past or the future of public art, for that matter, start with residents who have a complex, beautiful, and necessary view of public art. And some of their ideas are fantastical, but speak to deep truths or needs of the public sphere, especially the thirst for more representation, more expansion of what we consider common knowledge, but also practical solutions. Like if you want to know where to start here. And this model of the report to the city, we have extended and grown with other collaborators in St. Louis, as I mentioned, in Newark, New Jersey with New Arts Justice. And we're preparing other projects like this with partners around the country who are also now interested in making sure that before we try to find new outcomes alone, that we're also changing and piloting new ways of gathering information and historical knowledge.
Very, very quickly, I think this slide might be a little bit hard to read. So can you talk us through what this is mapping here?
Yeah, so in addition to the kind of silhouette of the city, in the top left-hand corner, there's infographics about the topics that people self-identified, but the largest portion on the bottom half, there are some people who are really sticklers about what is a monument versus what is a memorial or what is sculpture or public art, and we like leaky boundaries of our categories. We want to meet people where they are. Monument is actually a way to talk about the past, present, and future together. So yes, when we put our data team on reading every single piece of paper and transcribing it and analyzing it, a large portion of what we found was people wanted sculpture. But there were actually a large number of people who wanted installations or performative work, like new rituals for the city. They wanted interactive. They wanted a memorial or monumental tree or bench, all the quotidian to the fantastical. So we wanted to show that when people say monument in the city of Philadelphia, and I would imagine this is true in other cities, they think about a number of kinds of modes of commemoration, of remembrance, and of public statements as well. And so that's what this page is a snapshot of.
Great, thank you. This conversation, we haven't even gotten through all of our slides. This conversation, I think, could go on for hours and hours, and we're getting so many great questions. So I thought we could dive in there in our last 10 minutes. I have one here that I imagine many of us would be interested to hear your thoughts on. What are your thoughts on the national conversation about monuments and statues of Confederate soldiers? And in general, I'd be interested to know, what about this moment you are finding particularly interesting or intriguing?
Well, I'll start.
It's
obviously the conversation in terms of Confederate monuments and all kinds of other problematic representations is long overdue. Right? Because without that conversation, it means there's no discussion, no acknowledgement, no address of the very pernicious actions that were perpetrated by many of these people who are embodied as almost beatified form as statues. And so that needs to be, that myth of that monuments bestow on that consecrate on all kinds of figures need to be broken up and at least have a dialogue around. A related question to that question is, well, what about Thomas Jefferson as opposed to Stonewall Jackson? Yeah. Right? And what about Winston Churchill as opposed to some fascist sympathizer in the UK or whatever? The way I always answer that is that Stonewall Jackson, was there anything that was kind of countervailing in terms of his actions outside of wanting to slavery to endure and to protect plantation owner rights and so on? I would say very little, right? And so, and moreover, in the case of many of these monuments, like the monuments on Monument Avenue and so on, they took place, they were erected well after the Civil War ended as well, right? So, and whereas someone like Thomas Jefferson, yes, should we know that he owned slaves, and is that important to know? Yes, that is important to know, and that should be an enduring discussion point about Thomas Jefferson. But Thomas Jefferson also provided discourse for a much more enlightened society, right? And formed a kind of foundational language for a work in progress called the United States of America. So I think that doesn't eliminate the his slave ownership, but it does countervail it discursively, and I think that's also an important consideration. So just like Winston Churchill, was he a leader in terms of the fight against fascism, unifying the country, unifying UK and allies, as opposed to his earlier anti-Semitic views? Yes, I would say that's a countervailing. Does that negate completely his anti-Semitic views, which he stopped espousing at some point beyond his youth? But even if he maintained it, does that countervail it? I would say yes, it countervails it to a degree, but it doesn't eliminate it. And so that's how I would say we need to make the equation of the question of elimination or removal of a statue take into account all these different factors, their contributions to history and society.
Yeah, I have a slightly different take, but one that relates. And just to say, the slide that's up here is a proposal that Ken and I with Monument Lab put out a few years ago in 2018 for Monument Avenue, called Suspension, which was to show each of the sculptures of Confederate figures in the process of being removed, and the figure of Arthur Ashe elevated higher. And of course, this is now moot because all of the Confederate figures, except Robert E. Lee, have been removed. One toppled by protesters, Jefferson Davis, and the others removed by the city after the state law changed that local municipalities could take down their own Confederate monuments on July 1st. Robert E. Lee is slated to come down later this fall. I think about the phrase, "this moment." Myself, many of us have uttered this. I wish I had a dime for every time I've said it or heard it. I'd have enough, at least for a lunch, if not more. But I say that jokingly, but I want to be really clear that this moment is predicated on many other moments. And if you are new to the monument conversation, welcome to the party. We're glad to have you here. But as I said, this has been going on for years, if not generations, right? Yeah. W.E.B. Du Bois in 1931 wrote for the publication The Crisis about monuments of war, and specifically Confederate monuments, and kind of pointing out this notion that he said one of the most difficult parts is that the explanation, the justification for those monuments, they're disingenuous. They're part of a campaign of the Lost Cause, which was meant to whitewash the histories of enslavement, the legacies of Black freedom and liberation, and to kind of justify in post-haste the efforts to uphold slavery and that system. And Du Bois wrote, of course, the plain truth of the matter would be an inscription, something like this: sacred to the memory of those who fought to perpetuate human slavery. But that reads with increasing difficulty as time goes on, he writes. Because he noted, even in the 1930s, that moment, which is like this moment, we're reckoning with the symbols of white supremacy, of the systems of slavery, of segregation, of subjugation, and the systems that uphold them, right? The monument's the tip of the iceberg. So I think that though it's difficult and challenging, it goes back to our conversation about permanence. If we want to heal, repair from the wounds of slavery, especially of Native American dispossession, of other forms of injustice, we want to be able to move forward. We have to really contend with the history that's gone largely uplifted and unchecked. And, you know, it's really interesting, and the city of Washington, D.C. just released a report this week by an uncanny commission named appointed by the mayor, DC Faces, where they actually set up a criteria about statues, public parks, sites that should be considered for recontextualization or removal. And that included the participation in slavery, the involvement in systemic racism, support for oppression, involvement in supremacy, and the violation of DC human rights. And of course, this is a moment of clash with the federal government. So I think we're in this moment where we have to understand monuments are made to change. Mm-hmm. And will we uphold systems and symbols that aim to freeze history and push away debate? Or will we embrace new forms of not just monument making, but new forms of monumental history and art, which invite the layers, the contradictions, and the new possibilities to live together?
Thank you. I think we have time for 2 more questions. But this one sort of tacks onto that and extends from that question of permanence. When making work like this that is not permanent by design, how does that square with issues of consumption and disposal? What is happening to these prototypes after they appear?
Yeah, I mean, it's from our first project, which was built in collaboration with RARE, Recycled Artists in Residency. You know, that in some ways is a kind of ideal. We talked about, for public safety's sake, which materials had to be store-bought and which had to be kind of built so that they, you know, could withstand public weight and public kind of investigation. But much of the materials of that sculpture were actually repurposed in an exhibition at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts or returned to the waste stream. Oh. There are projects that we've worked on, like All Power to All People with the artist Hank Willis Thomas, that artwork is now in the collection of PAFA and has traveled with Hank's mid-career retrospective. So it's been at Crystal Bridges and
was recently here in Washington, D.C.
That's right.
Yeah.
But then there are other works that are meant to be temporary. Mm-hmm. Their afterlife is in their documentation and in the kinds of relationships that are there. But I think it's a fair question. We've been really interested in looking at the creation of monuments with a half-life and thinking about these as artistic as well as environmental questions. How do you, in the creation of a monument, take into account its evolution, its decay, its renewal? This is a kind of new front, a new front for work, a new possibility, a new pathway to be able to think about the life cycle of art. And, you know, I don't think all of our projects that we've worked on have done this perfectly, but it's a kind of spirit running throughout, which is what happens when an artwork appears and disappears? Does it linger with you because it's been powerful, it's made an imprint? Does it linger with you because it looms, it's held above your head or weighty? And if it goes away, where else does it go? How do you maintain value, not just as financial, but as civic, as social, as interpersonal?
Mm-hmm. And this is actually a problem that's confronting the art world right now.
Yeah.
And in terms of, you know, especially there's a lot of art that talks about sustainability, ecological disaster, and so on. And yet it's, you know, took a lot of carbon power to make the work, and then how do you store the work, and then if it is bought by a museum, is accompanied by 2 curators to Europe, to Asia, and so on. So yeah, that's an important question. But I do think, just following up on Paul, I can think of Caitlin Pomerantz's beautiful work about the restoration of stoops for Washington Square Park. And we salvaged those things. Those things were actually salvaged. They were actually part of the dump, you might say, in terms of as Philadelphia is renovating and tearing down old buildings, these old stone stoops would be tossed away, and we repurpose them and so on. So it is something that we give a lot of consideration to.
Yeah, and just one note on her project, these salvage stoops from the waste stream, we said, like, you're not gonna stop the whole waste stream, but you can pluck a few objects. It went to the Philadelphia History Museum. And because of budget cuts, the Philadelphia History Museum with Caitlin Pomerantz's stoops closed. Mm. And so just thinking about, on one hand, as artists, we can present alternative possibilities or even models, but it is the investment in adaptable institutions as well that will help us understand permanence in new ways, adaptability in new ways, and belonging in new ways together.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. Okay, well, we'll get in one more, and I'm very sorry that we won't have time for everyone's questions. Thank you for submitting them. We'll end maybe with a big picture question, given that you are critical thinkers who spend quite a bit of time considering these issues. What do you see as public art's relationship to democracy? Is there a responsibility embedded within it because of this notion of it speaking to a plurality of local publics? So what are the responsibilities of monuments, in other words?
Yeah, I think that the responsibility, of course, doesn't lie in the monument, but the monument makers, the monument stewards, the monument debaters. And I think just that word plurality is really important. Democracy is not some solitary structure. It's not living in one place. It's living together as a network, as a set of relationships, as a web. Similarly, our public art, even the public art that's largely held by municipal agencies, is comprised of federal, local, state, museum, communities. So the more that we're able to understand the relationships that are necessary to not just sustain democracy, but protect it, to guard it, we'll also be able to do that in our art and vice versa. Art is a way that we deal with survival. It was a way that we deal with collectivity. It's the way we knit together our democracy. And I think that the more that we can understand that democracy isn't a solitary thing, but a set of relationships that must be upkept, must be tended to, that's also the way that we see art.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I prefer to answer the question this way. If what makes a good public work of art? A good public work of art, to me, produces a very complex and layered and very broad and deep dialogue about public constitution, about public space, about public embodiment within a boundary of the civic, right? If it does that, then then you have more democracy, I would say, because you have more public input and so on. But even that has its tricks involved. For example, we can say the bean, what's it called?
In Chicago.
Yeah, I forget the
court. Yeah.
by Anish Kapoor, is very successful by most metrics of, is it good in terms of popular? Do people like it? Do they have an embodied sense of self in relationship to it? All of that is true, but is it also problematic in the sense that a few $1 million is spent maintaining it every year? That the work was paid off after almost a decade, pinching off a lot of public funds for that, and ostensibly as a kind of reclamation project over disused railroads for a very high income precinct as an extension of the center part of Chicago. All those types of questions are also important, despite my saying that's a very successful work of art. So even when it fulfills all the terms of public discourse, we still have to look deeper.
Well, thank you so much. This has been incredibly rich and rewarding conversation today. I wish, again, that we had more and more time to continue. I'd encourage everyone to take a look at Monument Lab's website if you're interested in learning more about their projects and what they're doing. Ken and Paul, thank you for making time for this during a busy, I know it's a busy first week of class, so we're especially grateful that you were able to be here with us today.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for this
I want to say
conversation.
hi to Melissa too, whom I know.